Well, thank you guys for doing this. It's going to be fun.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you for asking us to do this, and thank you for organizing this. I think it's important.
Do we need 3 or 4 minutes on each other, on ourselves, Shuja?
I think up to you, right? I mean, it's I just, you know, we, yeah, use your judgment, like, yeah.
It's 45 minutes total, right? So you probably don't want to.
Yeah, that's why I was like, if all of us go, it'll be like 20 minutes just talking about ourselves.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. I didn't do the math on that one. But yeah, so yeah, I think we'll leave, like, you know, do 30 minutes of, or, you know, 20 minutes of, you know, our questions, and then we can open up to the audience depending on how many questions are coming in. Wow, there are 48 people here. Are we live yet, Surya?
Yes.
Oh, we are. Okay, awesome. So let's just give another minute for people to just dial in, and we can get started. Well, thank you all for coming and joining this session on what's happening, what's next, and making sense of the new normal. We'll just give another minute or so to get started. All right, guys. Hi, my name is Shuja Keen. I'm the president of the MIT Club of Northern California. Thank you for joining our first of the series, which we've just started on, you know, what's happening, what's next, and trying to make sense of this new world order we live in. Joining us today are six other MIT alums, all coming from different backgrounds. And we wanted to, like, tap into sort of the collective wisdom of this group to sort of try to make sense of what's going on in the world we live in. So why don't we just get started? I'm going to ask each of them to do a quick introduction, and I'll start from the screen, which is on the, you know, the top left corner of my Zoom window, which is Atif Mian. Atif, over to you.
Thanks, Shuja, and thank you, fellow MIT alums, for joining us. It's a privilege to be able to speak to you today. My name is Atif Mian. I'm currently a professor of economics at Princeton University. My area of expertise is macroeconomics and finance, so I've done a lot of work looking at the financial crisis, but these days looking at sort of the deeper structural problems plaguing the U.S. economy, and obviously, you know, what's going to happen as a result of the COVID crisis and all of that. So I look forward to chatting a bit about that. MIT, I have a long MIT career, if you like. I came in '93 as a freshman, class of '97, and then ended up staying at MIT for my PhD as well. So I was 18C math with computer science undergrad, and then did a PhD in economics before diving into the world of academics. So again, look forward to chatting with all of you.
Sure. Awesome. Thanks, Atif. Pegah, you're next.
Hello, guys. Same, really excited to talk with you guys and have a conversation really around what's happening and different takes, both from someone. So I'm currently COO of Cisco's collaboration business, which covers 6 different business lines. So in a lot of ways, it's been good for business and bad for business, so we can get into that. And prior to that, I was COO at Morgan Stanley, technology franchise, and then CIO before that. So I also have a lot more of the buyer's perspective and how spending in technology is going to go in the coming environment. And I'm excited to talk with you guys. And at MIT, I was a course 14 14 economics and minored in biology and mathematics just for because I liked it, but I knew I was going to go more into finance, and I'm excited to actually meet a lot of people that have touched other sectors as well, so biology and all the things going on there.
Cool. Thanks, Pegah. Sudeb.
Oh yeah, I also wanted to echo that sentiment, Shuja. It's really that this is not only the most challenging moment really for healthcare, but really of our generation. And so I appreciate you putting together a series like this, because it's precisely events like this which help us provide a guiding light for those looking for reconciliation and for answers. So thank you for putting this together. Thank you to the guests for joining. I'm an infectious disease physician at Stanford Hospital and Palo Alto Medical Foundation, where I see hospitalized and critically ill patients. I have been referred to as a frontline physician in various aspects, but I feel that I've always been a physician for critically ill patients, COVID and non-COVID. I have an outpatient clinical practice in infectious disease. I'm on the faculty at the School of Medicine, where I teach courses in epidemiology, virology, genomics, and public health. And I'm also medical director at a Series B startup company here in the Bay Area, which develops testing for emerging infections. So I guess the irony is that I've been smack dab in the middle of this pandemic even before it started, and certainly happy to serve as a resource on this panel and in other venues. So thank you. I was at MIT class of 02, like Pegah, course 9, lived at Next House. And I, among other things, I was class of 02 president and served on the MIT Corporation from 2003 to 2008. I still maintain a lot of connections to the Institute, and welcome the chance to participate in alumni events. So thanks.
Thanks, Sudeb. Rohini?
Yes, I'm Rohini Chakravarthy. I'm a partner at a venture firm here in Palo Alto called NGP Capital. And before this, I've been in venture actually ever since I left Sloan. So I'm a class of 99, and I have been in venture for now 20 years. So 3 cycles, if we're counting. At Intel Capital for 7 years. I was briefly at Cisco in the M&A group, so have some connections there with Pegah. And then I was at NEA, which is a venture firm that invests pretty broadly in tech and life sciences for about 9 years. So I lead the enterprise practice at NGP. We also invest in smart mobility, which is transportation and logistics. So I have a perspective on how companies are dealing with it in both of those areas around the world. So really happy to be here. I lived off campus, so my experience of MIT was probably a little bit different than some of the other participants here, but we had some really great parties, and MIT style, we call them C functions. So if you know from the economics world. Thank you, Shuja, for having me on.
Oh, awesome. Kashif.
Hi, thank you, Shuja, for assembling the team. Really looking forward to the discussion given the breadth of participants. My name is Kashif Riaz. I'm class of 1998, and I live in New York City, and I work at BlackRock. I'm an investor in the fixed income group. I focus more on credit than any other asset class, but do get a lot of exposure to rates and emerging markets as well. I've had a 21-year career in finance before the 10 years that I've been at BlackRock today. I spent about a dozen years at JP Morgan in various banking and capital markets functions. At MIT, I was course 15 undergrad. I lived at the number 6 club.
Oh, thanks, Kashif. And Abid.
Yeah, thanks, Shuja, and thanks everyone for joining. So Abid Rizvi, I was MIT undergrad 96, Sloan 97. Spent about 20 years after that in consulting and banking, mostly focused on the consumer and retail space, and then eventually ended up joining one of my clients, which is Arizona Beverages, where I'm now currently the Chief Operating Officer. When I was at MIT, I stayed at Burton for my undergrad. And I guess my favorite memory of MIT is probably the foosball table in the in the TV area in Burton, where we spent plenty of all-nighters, probably more there than I did studying for exams.
Awesome. Well, thank you, guys. I'm just looking at the count. I think we've got 75 participants. I think we're going to make this interactive. I think we're going to go over some questions over the course of the next 15, 20 minutes, and then open up for audience questions. So please on your Zoom windows, there's an icon called Q&A. Please put in your questions in the Q&A window. And that's where all the panelists can see the questions coming in. I believe other participants can see those questions and they can upvote your questions as well. Please don't put them in the chat window. I think it's more difficult to see it. It gets lost. So throw those out. So I'll get started. So I think given, we've got a very interesting perspectives, folks from across the country with very different backgrounds. I'll just get started with, we can go in the reverse order, but just if you guys sort of reflect back on, where we are today and what those last 3 months have been for you, and you can take it, any sort of, feel free to be as candid as you want. So Abid, why don't you get, to share some moments with us?
Sure. Look, so being a beverage company, we were considered essential for as far as the overall economy is concerned. So for us, it was much more around figuring out, how can we keep the trains running, so to speak, once all of this started happening. We go back with probably about 40 different plants. We've got trucks all over the country. So when this hit, we had to kind of manage it pretty much on a day-to-day basis. It was a bit of a whack-a-mole that we had to play, because we obviously wanted to make sure that as people were buying groceries and people are consuming more and more food and beverages at home, as opposed to going to restaurants or office cafeterias, that we kept the shelves stocked. Otherwise there would be riots on the streets. We couldn't avoid those, but for a different reason. So I think as far as that was concerned, we had to keep all the plants going. We obviously had to very quickly pivot and make sure that people, just like everybody else, could work from home as needed. Plants, we had to literally overnight put in all of the different procedures so that people could social distance while still producing the products. We had lots of issues with trucking. Frankly, for that matter, even finding some of the temp labor was a bit of a challenge for a period of time. But look, so far so good. I think as far as many businesses are concerned, food and beverage businesses have actually fared very well through this process, because again, people are consuming more, people are pantry loading, and if something is in their pantries, it usually gets consumed.
Kashif?
Sure. So I'll go over a little bit over the past few months. So our first, starting from early March, the first task was really to shift all company operations to a work from home setting. And one thing that our company was able to do that I'm sure that many other multinationals have been able to do was really learn from the experiences of our offices in Singapore, Hong Kong, and Tokyo from a couple months earlier, and apply those learnings to the much larger operations both in the US and in Europe. And I think we're frankly pleasantly surprised at how seamlessly operations were able to shift, especially in an environment that tends to be very data intensive and very transaction intensive, that all of our global trading and investment operations started working very effectively from home in a very short period of time. And we moved from a setting where on any given day you speak to dozens, if not, call it up to 100 colleagues, and trying to replicate that workflow and that level of dialogue through video conferencing tools, etc. So we have adapted to running our whole company using Cisco products, and it's been a real it's been a one that was pleasant. But at the same time as managing the operational hurdles, there were two others. One was the health and safety challenges given where we are. So I personally was afflicted with COVID in the second half of March, as were a number of colleagues at various levels of severity. So we had colleagues hospitalized for significant periods of time, and a lot of the company's focus and attention, while being rightly on business operations as well as markets, was also on colleagues and families' health and safety. And the third thing is that during this time period, the financial markets in which we operate went through a period of obviously, everyone's probably well aware of exceptional volatility, to a point where for a few weeks in the latter part of March, it was not just markets repricing to a new economic environment and considering recessionary impacts and distress for all the parts of the economies that rely on people being close together, but there were, I think, fundamental questions and concerns about market functioning for a couple of weeks in March. And so those were all things that were directly affecting us while working in a new environment, while being under personal stress. So that phase is thankfully past us, both personally and as an industry. But it was a very both interesting and challenging time, and I think that it showed a lot of resilience was displayed personally and at company levels. And now, obviously, as society, we face new and evolving challenges, but at least that part of it is quite stabilized.
No, thanks. I'm glad you're doing well as well from a health perspective. Rohini.
Yeah. So I think from maybe I'll give you our firm's view on it, and we can expand out to sort of the venture view if people are interested. But basically, we are a global firm, so we have a practice in China and we have a practice in Europe as well. So we saw a little bit of this coming early on because our China companies went into lockdown, and our China team started working from home starting in January. And we went into this survive and thrive mode. So we wanted to make sure that companies were doing, first of all, they had a plan to survive the initial shock. And then we had to come up with this idea of how do you thrive through this crisis. So here in the US, basically, around, I think in California, we went into lockdown around March. So we've now been in 10 weeks of lockdown. Most of our companies have employees working remotely. In our smart mobility portfolio, we were quite affected, actually. There are companies where they lost, 95% plus of their revenue because, if you're in the mobility space and you're not working. And so there were quite a few, there are a few companies that have gone into full furloughs. In Europe, that has been I would say more functional because the government has stepped in a way where employees were still attached to the companies, whereas in the US we've had to sort of work through layoffs and so on. And the survive mode for the most part meant for people that they wanted to keep 18 to 24 months of cash available, right? So either, and initially it was not that you could go raise immediately, although people got there eventually. So there was a lot of looking at cost cuts, and we did see some layoffs and so on. And that meant for the next 2 or 3 weeks, a lot of our companies were looking at the PPP, the Paycheck Protection Plan, because they were all looking at 15, 20, 25% job cuts and in response to COVID. So there was a lot of, I would say, a lot of gyrations there because we were not sure if the companies were actually eligible. NVCA had a pretty good program to try and communicate what was happening and how the rules were changing. The rules changed a lot over the last 4, 5, 6 weeks. And eventually, actually, quite a few of our companies that got PPP loans gave them back. There are only a couple that eventually kept them, and I think a few of them, I mean, the ones that kept them are under this $2 million safe harbor that that the government came and announced. So in the venture world, it was quite a dramatic sort of self-imposed drama in some ways because we didn't know what was happening, so we had to to cut before you could figure out what was next.
Can you just like dial it quickly into like why did the venture-backed companies decide not to take PPP or funding, or if they did, they returned it back?
Yeah, so I mean it's a longer conversation, but basically the rules were changing. Initially, when it came out, the boards had to sign off on penalty of perjury that that we needed this money. So there wasn't anybody else outside actually validating if these companies needed money or not. So the boards were required to sign off on penalty of perjury. And we were asked to essentially document and provide contemporary records to say this is why we felt we needed the money at this point in time, which is kind of what we did with all of these companies. But then I think it got quite politicized when I think Shake Shack got some of the PPP money, and people were saying, hey, this was meant for small mom and pop businesses, and it's not meant for big businesses, and certainly it shouldn't be for businesses that can access other types of capital. So if you are a startup and you have raised venture capital, was this really meant for you? And people were, there was going to be an audit, and people started making all of these noises about how political the process could get. And I think a combination of that, and also maybe a little bit of the market clearing, where it's now getting more clear that there is a rotation into tech. So if you feel like you don't really need this money, people kind of gave that back. But a few of them did keep the money because they, the layoffs are real, right? You do the layoffs, and you're now trying to work with 30% fewer of your workforce. There are other ramifications, but we can talk about some more of that. It was a very confusing time, I would say. And then I think now we're getting, maybe I'll just stop with one point and tee it up for future further conversations. Within our portfolio, we have the smart mobility area, and then we have the enterprise area. In the smart mobility area, things like food delivery, grocery delivery, these types of companies are doing quite okay. In fact, we are seeing new habits form, and consumers are starting to do things in a new way. And I think this is going to be a change that will last for a while. And so a lot of that has been to shore up those companies. Our travel companies are quite impacted, and they've all reacted in different ways. We actually have had some positive exits, in companies where we thought we would hold them for another 5 years, but we got an opportunity to exit. We exited sooner than expected. The enterprise space has, in general, done quite well, and you might see this in the stock market as well, Kashif, that I think there's been a rotation into tech, and some of our companies are benefiting from that. We'll still see what the separation looks like, but the initial shock has passed a little bit, I would say, and people are now starting to figure out, okay, where can we invest in this new infrastructure that's going to be needed post-COVID.
Thanks, Rohini. Sudeb. I think, Sudeb, you're on mute.
Sure, Shuja, thanks for that question. I would say that with regards to COVID-19 over the past few months, my experience has really evolved. And while I will say without ambiguity, it's been overwhelming at a lot of times. It's been overwhelming for a lot of providers and patients, and certainly for people who are strained at these times. A lot of individuals have really risen to the occasion, and I myself have tried to embrace the responsibility and really the privilege, I guess, of my training putting me in a position to help out. I discussed a few weeks ago with Julia Yu on a different podcast that at first I was pretty discouraged. Early on, as you all know, there was a huge deficit in a lot of things, in the availability of testing, in the availability of triaging and managing individuals who were infected, even identifying who they were. Then CDC started sending tests, and at that time, it was very clear to us that that would be woefully inadequate to actually deal with a pandemic of this scale. And then we started preparing with what we had. So we prepared hospitals, outdoor testing sites, and tents. We started ramping up clinical trials. I was the lead on a few drug trials in the hospital, including a remdesivir trial, which is reporting results now. I tried to advise as many public health phone calls that I received. We started trying to get out publications and data as quickly as possible. It was very mission-driven work, and honestly, it was very inspiring and uplifting at the same time that we were dealing with patients. Because then came the mass panic, the lack of testing, the hoarding, the shortages, death and horrible illness, and my colleagues in New York especially. It was particularly disheartening to hear what they were going through. There were 3 a.m. Zoom calls just to make sure hospitals were continuing to function and that we could see patients and we knew what to do if we surged and if our capacity was overwhelmed. To be honest, the clinical work was not overwhelming. This is not a particularly challenging illness to deal with. And I knew that we would be able to keep most patients alive if we had enough bed staffing and equipment, and we did, fortunately, in our hospital. I would say PPE was thin, but we didn't run out, and we were able to manage through and secure supplies relatively quickly. We had relatively few deaths in our hospital. Patients remained ventilated for weeks sometimes in the ICU, and they were very ill, but we managed to keep them alive. I guess the other thing I would add is about sheltering in place and how, I guess, myself and my family experienced that. We're a dual physician household, and we have a little baby who just turned 1 year old this month, actually. So this was the busiest few months of our careers, I would say. I actually didn't get to see my son much at all. And I was pretty convinced he forgot who I was. But then last night, when I was trying to put him to sleep, he pulled my hair and poked me in the eye and put a toy in my mouth. So I can see that he knows who his dad is. And I guess the last thing I would say is how I coped and where the resilience came from, as it has for a lot of people. And there's certainly been a lot of tragedy, and there's more difficulties even nowadays with the latest things that are going on. And what I've always tried to do, and my practice has always been, when I go in to see a patient, particularly someone who's ill, I try to take a moment of silence and imagine what it must be like to be that person. And that's even when I go into a hospitalized patient's room in the ICU who's sedated and can't speak and can't respond, whether they're COVID or not, whether it's a phone call to a family member where I have to tell them that their loved one probably isn't going to survive despite us doing everything we can. I try to take a moment before making that call or going in and imagine what it's like to have to be that person on the receiving end. And that's how I'm trying to deal with some of the things that are going on these days socially. And I take a moment each day to look through that lens also. So there, right now, I think, are a lot of reasons for optimism, while at the same time, it's a very important moment, I think, in reflection of what's happened. And I do have a lot of confidence we'll be much better prepared next time.
No, thank you for your thoughts. Over to you, Atif.
Oh.
Sorry.
Thanks, Shuja. First of all, let me just say, I think Sudeb and your colleagues, healthcare workers, we are just all in awe of what you guys are doing. And I think we all owe a great deal of gratitude to what you guys are working on. I'm myself an economist, so I'll just speak I study the US economy for a living. So just let me just say a few things from that perspective. The first observation, which is kind of disappointing, is that the response of US as a country to the COVID crisis has been, less than overwhelming. If you look at the US, people always talk about the US as the richest country in the world, the most advanced country in the world. And on the financial side, it's a country with what is called the exorbitant privilege, which is that it's a country that can borrow the most at like the cheapest possible rate you can imagine. In fact, so much so that people are literally willing to give money to the US and demanding negative returns in return. And yet, despite of all of those advantages, if you look at the public response as a country, as a nation, it's pretty bad. You see it in the health numbers, obviously, in the number of dead, in the rate of infection, unable to bring it under control as quickly as some of the other countries. But you also see it on the economic dimension. You see it in the increase in unemployment rate that we have seen in the US relative to, let's say, some of countries in Europe or China for that matter. And I think that really is a time of reflection of, while we have become a country that excels at the individual level at some level, we have become pretty bad at pulling together as a nation when it comes to public crises. And I'm going to use that to segue into what I feel are really deeper issues. Some of those deeper structural issues that have to do with the ability of the society to develop and evolve in a healthy manner. I was already studying that before the COVID crisis, those fault lines, so to speak. But the COVID crisis in many ways has brought those fault lines to the surface and is now threatening to tear them apart. And I think that's something that's very important for us to understand. If the COVID crisis came in at a point when the US was sort of at a healthy balance beforehand, I think if it would have been a crisis, it's a deep crisis, but you'll get over it because it's a pandemic. Ultimately, we'll have a vaccine and all of that, and a year out, we'll be kind of fine. But my worry is that that's not the state we were in when the COVID hit us. We were already facing some deep underlying problems that this crisis threatens to amplify. So what are those problems? To borrow a term maybe from the health or even the ecological side, we use this term called homeostasis, which means all systems, they have a tendency to come back to balance. And then you need that for systems to survive, whether it's ecological system or the physical planets and so on. The same is true for the economy. It needs a healthy balance. And the US economy had been losing that balance for a while. You can look at it when you look at the numbers like rising inequality. You can look at it when you look at numbers like falling in mobility across generations and so on. And the problem is that for a country like the US, that is just not sustainable. And one way you see that is that while people at the very top are becoming richer and wealthier at various senses of the word, that wealth is not translating into real investment for the economy overall. And so you're seeing this quote unquote financialization of the economy, where you see the tremendous amount of credit and debt in the economy, and yet investment actually is falling. Real investment to GDP is falling. And so without that, the economy overall is not going to grow. And that shows up in many ways, socially and politically. And to link it back to the Black Lives Matter and all, those kinds of tensions coming out to the forefront. I'll just end on that. There's a lot of talk about going forward, but the thing about the COVID crisis is that the crisis itself is affecting people very differently. I mean, most of the people on this call, I presume, we are relatively safe from this, both health-wise and financially. But there's a lot of pain out there. It's a very asymmetric shock. Let's not lose sense of that. And the people who were already suffering, it's sort of a double whammy on them, number one. And number two, our system, for all the reasons I tried to allude to in the very beginning, is not working very well in trying to uplift those people. And so that's going to be really a big challenge, that sort of polarization on number of fractal levels for the US. And that's kind of the core challenge that we'll have to address going forward.
Yeah.
And,
all right,
and I actually will second, I couldn't agree more on those points. As a business, I know Rohini mentioned, look, in so many metrics, the economy seems to be in some sectors back. Like people are beating estimates on certain things. And then you look at how those companies are affected versus the job losses. And even though we're excited the job losses aren't as much, the reality is some of those jobs aren't coming back. And I can tell you, we as a country don't necessarily look at the ripple effects of those things. You look at the people impacted, it's mostly young. You look at the unemployment is mostly in certain jobs that might not recover as fast as, let's say, a SaaS business and otherwise. So I do think it's interesting to see how right now we're thinking of it as social issues, but I think they also come back to impact us from a growth across the macro level as well, because if you don't have as much of a middle class, you're not going to sell as many iPhones and all these other things as well, right? So it's kind of an interesting time where there's this roller coaster of thinking things are getting worse than we think, or we're overreacting, and both from a health standpoint, because the news flows are so much that one day you feel like you're overreacting, one day you feel like you're underreacting, and the same I feel like economically. It's like so from a personal standpoint, I have two young kids too. I just feel like in a personal life, I feel like a roller coaster. And then as business side, I feel like a roller coaster because our revenues are doing great. And then at the same time, you're hearing job losses. So you're kind of not sure if you're overreacting or underreacting almost every day.
Yeah.
You're definitely not reacting exactly how you should be. I can tell you that. We don't have it right.
Right. And if I could add the healthcare equivalent to that, first I would say that we've learned a valuable lesson, certainly, in the inadequacies and deficiencies of the public health infrastructure of this country. And we actually knew that fairly early on, even before the virus came to this country, and from projections based on SARS, MERS, and other outbreaks, that if it were to come, it would be devastating. We already knew that before it happened, and then we learned very quickly that the public sector's ability to address pandemics like this, whether we're talking about tests or innovation or scalability or even distribution of information, we learned the lesson very hard that that was inadequate. And we also learned that the private industry, that industry innovation, scalability, and really stepping up to the plate to help us develop tests, everybody sort of gravitated toward this problem. And that partnership, while not previously fully materialized, now is essential. We do understand that public the public-private partnership is critical, and so our hope is that federal investment in and incentivization of these kinds of efforts will, by default, enable coordination when it's needed the next time. But that partnership really does need to be prioritized. And for the first time in our generation, this has now been escalated in limelight in so many different ways, whether it's social media or the news or these concepts of epidemiology and infectious disease that no one was talking about before, but now we are. I think that this is an important moment. And we can and should capitalize on that moment. And I guess the other thing that I would say in response to something Atif brought up, which is the disparities piece. You know, I guess I would preface this thought by saying that this should not be interpreted as anything other than a deeper acknowledgement of the problem that's existed for a very long time. And it's not an attempt to defer away from COVID. You know, COVID certainly exemplified for us that health disparities exist and people of color are 10 times more likely to die, but people of color are 10 times more likely to die of XYZ illnesses. And we've known that throughout the history of modern medicine. There are disparities in who has access to care, who gets treated appropriately, who's insured, and who dies. We've always known that. And so the problems existed long before this, and while it is painful to go through right now, and I've certainly witnessed firsthand that people with advanced illnesses that should not have gone on for the months or years they did had to come in late because they were poor. These are things that are also now elevated into the spotlight, and regardless of how painful that is, I think that that's important as well.
So Sudeb, I'm just going to push you on that point, right? So how, as a practicing physician who's taken the Hippocratic Oath, how do you like balance that, like, you know, your service and sort of the, you know, saving the lives of the patient and, you know, providing that in, you know, adequately within the construct of the sort of the administration and the hospital administrations you work with, and then balancing that with like sort of social justice and making sure folks have access to it, right?
Yeah, it's a good question because myself, like any physician, we take on any patient that wants to see us. So we're fairly open in that regard, and so we do not discriminate, and we always try to help out. But that being said, most of my practice is still in Palo Alto, California. So that by design will be an imbalanced healthcare system. Those who can come to see us, whether it's Stanford or there's Palo Alto Medical, already represent a certain subset of society. And so one way that I've dealt with that in the past, and I'll tell you how that's evolved, is to, and I'll give you the example of disparities in HIV, where that was most of the work that I did prior to COVID, where there are a lot of disparities that are evident not only domestically, but also internationally, as we know. I often engaged enthusiastic, socially minded students. These typically were undergraduates at Stanford who want to do something to help, and quite frankly have the bandwidth and the time to help. We currently are starting an organization called idmonitor.org, which seeks to connect to these very kinds of communities, the ones that either have economic or language barriers to accessing information. The information is out there, much of it is misinformation. We try to curate and digest some of that information, make it consumable for other audiences. And we used to do that for HIV as well. And whether that's graphical media, audio, print, or even musical forms, we try to reach out to communities that may not have access to the same kind of information. So that's another way that I've tried to harness the enthusiasm of individuals who want to be advocates, while at the same time leveraging our position as a very resourced institution to help those that are less resourced. And we have many examples of having done that before. But that's one way that I've tried to balance the fact that we still live in this area, but still have the opportunity to invoke change from here.
Sure.
And I think the other thing I guess I would add from a corporate standpoint is that I do think it's interesting both with the movement around right now about Black Lives Matter as well as the pandemic. In general, there is this sense by corporates where they're stepping up, and whether it's they're stepping up for their workforce to make sure that their workforce feels like they're listening and being part of society. There is this shift of corporates being like, okay, the government is clearly, we've had this big gaping holes and they haven't done as much. And I do feel like companies feel like they're in the limelight of having to show up as well, more than ever, both from a shareholder standpoint, from employee standpoint. Look at right now, some of the stuff going on with Facebook. So I do think you're gonna see this in the next 5 to 10 years, just companies feeling like they have to step up more for various reasons. And I'm, as much as I think there's a lot of just saving face at times that companies are stepping up, I do think it doesn't matter the reason they're doing it. The fact that they have to listen is important, and maybe they will also impact the way the government behaves, because we all know the two ways are, voting as well as company interests, right? Those tend to drive a lot of the force behind elections. And so now that you have those two dynamics happening at the same time, I think it's a promising step for us.
Yeah, that's something which I hear from a lot of folks, is that this time it feels different, and there are elements which would catalyze change, broadly speaking. For those of you guys who joined in late, there's a Q&A box in your Zoom window. So if you could put in your questions over there, and we'll select the questions from the Q&A box as we go along. Asking, so in the next 10 minutes, we'll start asking audience questions.
There's a question, Shuja, there about China. And look, we have a large presence in China too. And I know
Sure.
Rohini and Kashif too. I will say what we saw it coming. We had like 1,000+ people just in collaboration that are in China. They were on lockdown. So we knew what it was going to take from a technology standpoint, and we prepared for that. But I don't think people were looking at, okay, what is it going to take from a healthcare standpoint as much? And that one was, China was not necessarily shown. We weren't seeing the fact that it's a big burden on them as much healthcare wise. It was more way of life wise and work wise. And I do think, though, what we're looking at right now from China is, I talk to colleagues in China all the time, just how they're coming out of the recovery, for giving a look ahead of how things might look. And I will tell you, economically, they're saving more. They're obviously using masks and things like that. So it's a lot of the stuff that's happening here, but I do think they're just a little bit more shy in spending. So their spending habits are just much lower than it was right before, even though technically things are opened up.
Yeah, I can pick up on a few related items there. So one thing I'd note is that until for the last few years, the concepts of applying big data and alternative data in the at least the public investment world have been talked about a lot, but frankly, until recently, it was kind of a toy. It was interesting and additive, but it wasn't fundamental to what you do. I think in the last few months, what we found is that when first monitoring China and Asia more broadly, things like mobility data, things like looking at air travel and flight cancellation metrics, as well as things, production metrics that are a little more real time, have been very useful to market participants in thinking about what parts of the economy will thrive and which ones are more severely impacted for longer. In addition to that, when thinking about what we've learned recently from Asia, the other thing that is being used a lot more for economic forecasting, specifically related to thinking about prices and market prices, is credit card and spending data, as well as the direct payment platform. So a lot of that has come to pass in and is now a real investment tool. And just in terms of thinking forward as to what things will mean revert and what things might be secular shifts, that certainly feels notable to me.
Actually, there's a follow-on question. This is an MIT audience which likes to get into
Right.
data and be more specific. So they're like, what metrics seem to be more useful and reliable as you were looking at trend data over time?
The most obvious is credit and debit card data, and broken down by segments, and importantly by income tiers. So a lot of over the past month or so, there's been, I'm sure everyone has seen in the press, pieces that talk about the markets being disconnected from the economy and the employment situation. And it's true. And one of the reasons why is that there is a big part of the population that matters less economically and less to companies' profit margins because they're effectively not as active participants in as much of the high value economy. And so it becomes easier for growth stocks and other segments of the market to outperform, because a lot of the consumers are more privileged people like us who are sheltered in place, but have jobs, income, and are able to spend from the comfort of our homes. So that data is important. Mobility data and everything empowered by GPS has been a big part of it. And obviously there's also a lot of discussion on what that means for civil liberties and surveillance, et cetera. But it's that data aggregated is being used to look at what parts of the economy and what parts of the world are seeing a resumption of activity. And it's so far tended to be a little bit of a leading indicator.
Yeah. So maybe just to add to that, like in our corner of the economy, I mean, of course, in the venture world, we're still in a relatively inefficient and illiquid part of the market compared to what Kashif would see. So, but our metrics are, they're kind of all over the place right now. Everybody expected, so first of all, there was a correction in all stocks, and people expected, when the venture world is fairly correlated with the public market. So, when things started to fall, people were expecting some valuations to start coming down. And then, of course, the stock market has done what it has done and kind of gone back. So for the most part, the valuation correction, especially for high quality companies, we're not seeing that. I think the comps are still holding strong, and especially in SaaS, the SaaS multiples have actually expanded. And so it's really hard to believe, but I think when the Main Street economy is doing what it's doing with 40 million people unemployed, in our part of the world, we actually see an expansion in valuations, which has been kind of interesting, and people have to figure out how to play that. There's also a big capital overhang, right? So people have been watching how much venture money is on the sidelines, and last count was $150 billion that has been raised and has not been deployed. And so that also feeds into our value. So our valuations are really hard because it's like, the pricing happens at the margin. And, if you have $150 billion waiting to invest, in any one of these rounds, it's kind of difficult to figure out who moves first and where you land. But that said, I think the growth stage companies, we have had some financings happen, and we've gotten 2 or 3 bids in one case, and they came in quite close to each other. So there is a market that's working, but the comps and both the part of money that's sitting on the sidelines is complicating valuations for us.
Have you seen venture finance, venture pricing come down, valuations come down? Getting better deals, Rohini?
Well, we'd love to, but yeah, no, we are expecting it, but we haven't yet seen it. So in our portfolio, we've had some financings happen. One was, quite a strong up round. There was one that was priced that closed in April, and the lead chickened out, and they decided to do a convertible note and not set the pricing yet. So it'll get priced in later. But even in that one, it looks like right now that it'll actually price price higher when it eventually prices. So it's we haven't yet seen a lot of down rounds, but we are expecting them, and part of that is because people focused on cash, and as people
and I will say, I guess, just having working in collaboration and really talking about workplace transformation for a number of years, I do think in addition to healthcare being accelerated through this pandemic, I do think companies, like Kashif was mentioning, are just realizing how to be more resilient. And that's probably why there's this flight to also technology, because you need a better digital strategy going forward, whether you're a mom and pop, shop, or whether you're a doctor. I've had a number of telemedicine calls with doctors where I used to go all the time, and now I will tell you they're going to evolve to take that on. And so, especially in sectors where it's been hard to digitally transform, because the pain of teaching people and changing behavior was hard. In an effect, the magnitude of this pandemic forced people to have to learn things out of necessity, which they won't unlearn, right? So, do I think business travel is going to go back? Yes, but not to the same levels as fast. But I do think there's just a lot of industries that weren't tapping into creating digital assets. And even think about it, doctor forms, you always have to go fill it out by hand. Now I have doctor practices that are giving you forms online. Like, we all wished for that even when we were going into the office and doctors weren't as much adopting it, right? So I think there's going to be some positives to make some efficiencies in the market, which is why some of the SaaS multiples are so crazy, because people are depending more and more on technology.
All right. Yeah, no, this is the longest I have not traveled in 20 years, and my body is very thankful for that. There's a question from the audience, and I think Abid, I am going to ask you to sort of answer this. So there's a question around sort of, there's a lot of talk about reshaping the supply chain, and how do you de-risk exposure to China from a manufacturing and distribution perspective. So could you comment on what's working, what's not happening, especially looking at it from consumer goods perspective, and what are sort of the workarounds from import tariffs angle as well?
Look, I think similar to what a lot of other people are saying, this is a bit of a shock to the system, and I think everybody is continuing to learn how best to evolve. I think we've always were taught globalization was good for the global economy, and it has been a very strong disinflationary force, right? Part of the reason we've been able to enjoy the kind of cost of living, the standard of living that we've had, is because of a lot of this disinflation that we essentially brought in from very cheap goods from around the world. Look, again, consumer packaged goods industry is somewhat local in many ways, right? I mean, our corrugate and stuff like that may come from other parts of the world, but a lot of our core products are actually made within the US anyway. But having said that, look, this is going to impact every single industry, I think, and unfortunately, it's not to kind of take too macro a perspective on some very specific question, but I think we may do things as a government which may not be the best thing to do as an overall solution, because tariffs, as we were all taught in economics back at MIT, are not the right answer, right? I think so I guess, long story short, I think tariffs and all of these things, a lot of companies are going to bring their supply chains much closer to home, because they don't know when something like this may happen again. Definitely for anything which would be remotely considered an essential industry, I think we should have supply chains much closer to home. But I think we need to do that not in a rushed manner, but in a coordinated manner with all of our allies, not necessarily just go it alone, as seems like we're currently doing.
Right.
The only thing I would add to that on supply for products, I will say the tariffs, like Abid was saying, catalyzed a lot of companies to be thinking about it, and now it's more a shift to diversification versus moving away from just necessarily. So it costs have to make sense, but there's definitely was already a shift to diversification in different regions, whether it was let's move to Vietnam or Mexico or other areas, or bring back home. And I just think that's going to get accelerated even more for companies that were on the edge of thinking about it. Now they have to build more resilient supply chains in case something happens somewhere else.
Yeah, so I think we're going to coming up to the end of our time. It's time's flying by. So I'm going to sort of go around the various panelists to throw out sort of one last question at them. And if you could keep it within sort of like a minute or so, that'd be really helpful. Atif, I'm going to start off with you. I think there are a couple of questions from the audience. And I guess it's broadly speaking that the government has thrown in a lot of like stuff at trying to keep the economy going, but with sort of expanded unemployment benefits, other sort of policy initiatives, they're all going to run out soon. So what are tools left to sort of keep the economy going or come out of this recession, and any other parting sort of silver lining thoughts that you may have?
Well, ultimately, that's why I started off talking about balance. I mean, ultimately, the economy has to take care of itself, and the government cannot kind of keep it on ventilator, to keep an analogy, for forever. So for the economy to come back organically to life, it is important that demand comes back to normal. I think that's the key thing. And so, people mentioned metric. One metric that I would keep an eye out on is the 10-year treasury rate, which has gone down, and it's like at the lowest level in, historically speaking, in modern times. The reason I say that is because sort of negative real rates on 10-year treasuries is telling us two things. Number one, a lot of people with money, with wealth, are trying to save, right? So they are pushing capital into the financial markets, but that money is not finding many avenues to go somewhere productively. So investment is very low while a lot of people are pushing money in. And so all they can do is buy existing financial paper, and treasury is the most dominant one. And so the price of that rises, which is to say the interest rates go further down and down. So that is a very worrying sign. And with the increased in kind of precautionary savings in China and elsewhere that people have already alluded to, the question is, we need real demand. People need to be willing to spend that money, or they need to be willing to borrow and invest that money one way or the other. And neither of those two things are happening at a very healthy rate. So that's the fundamental imbalance that I was referring to earlier as well. And that's not coming back anytime soon, to the extent we can look at the numbers from the private sector. So I think that is kind of my core worry going forward. And right now it's the government that is stepping in and spending on behalf of all of us. And I think that's a good thing. I would say, the government has to take this ventilator off gradually. They should not do it suddenly. And so that's, so I think there is some kind of protocol management, so to speak, at the macro level that needs to be done. And again, one of the metrics I would look at is things like the 10-year treasury rate and things of that nature, to figure out whether the economy is coming back to life on its own, or if it still needs this kind of ventilator support.
Cool. Thank you. Sudeb, I think from your perspective, is it safe to go out? Are we ready to go back to normal? How do we make sure that we don't sort of, we're just getting out of sort of shelter in place and we don't have another second wave?
Thank you for that question. I do generally think it's safe to go out/outside. The recent guidance is still that universal masking is recommended. I would say as restaurants and other retail and other industries start to open up, there are the most obvious things that people can do. Wear a mask, clean your table, clean your seat, bring hand sanitizer with you. And at the same time, avoiding crowds. I think that the current crowds related to protests probably will lead to a brief uptick, probably not a large second wave, given that most of that is outdoors. But it'll be discouraging, particularly because those are the very same populations that already are affected by disparities anyway. But I do think that it'll be a staged reopening as we're experiencing. Some states are doing it more quickly than others and in different fashions. Some states haven't necessarily met the criteria for opening, but are doing so anyway. And nationally, I think that just speaks to the lack of any universal guidance regarding that. And it's hard to do that in a country like ours, where we value a lot of autonomy amongst various states. But at the same time, I guess to maybe address at the same time a question that was asked about the pandemic playbook. I haven't read that book, but I imagine what's in it, and we certainly it certainly came to the forefront that we were not prepared in the way that we'd want to. And this only speaks to more national guidance and strengthening of CDC to help deliver some of those guidelines. So while I do think it's safe generally to be outdoors, I do think a second wave will probably be here in the fall to some degree. And the things that we've learned from this pandemic regarding hand washing, distancing, et cetera, those will be exercised in a yearly fashion. And that can only help us.
Sure. Rohini, question for you. As we are coming out of this environment, where are opportunities to invest in, post-COVID world? Rohini, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so we're still figuring out where all the chips will fall, but it's pretty clear that tech and essentially remote work and remote health and remote education and all of these have been a godsend. Even though it hasn't really worked 100%, I think our lives would have been much worse if we were not able to meet digitally. So I think we see that trend will continue. The second one, which is a big one, and for us it's a big one, is around the gig economy. Right? The gig economy has become a big thing, and when you have 40 million people unemployed, one of the quickest ways to put them back to work is through the gig economy. They may not be the best jobs, but they have the flexibility and so on. So we do think that the gig economy will recover. It's a very creative part of the startup environment, and they will take into account a lot of the new social distancing guidelines, and I think we will see much more of that, right, where people want things brought to them, and so I think we will see that. Maybe a couple of things that I've not touched on, which I'm interested in. It's not something we invest in our firm, but this whole movement towards I think in general sustainability and climate change related topics, including things like plant-based meats and so on. I think that continues to be a big area of interest, because people have figured out that part of the answer here is to go to a more sustainable way of living, and I think there is definitely a lot of interest in that in the venture world. So new agriculture, and so lots of interesting ideas that are coming there to invest.
Oh, thanks, Rohini. Pegah, what's the silver lining for you?
Oh, silver lining? Oh, a lot. We touched on a lot of them. I'm hoping, based on what Sudeb said, school's going to start. So that's my silver lining with 2 kids at home. I will say, I think the silver lining is we're reflecting on what things aren't working, and some of them have put a microscope on things that weren't working for a long time, but we weren't just looking at them or wanting to look at them. So I think that's actually going to be the biggest silver lining, us just the whole inequality issue that we're going to look harder at, as well as our healthcare system, and just being prepared and asking more of our government, right?
Cool. Thanks. Kashif, the parting thoughts from you?
Sure. I'd say, as Rohini mentioned, I think that the imbalances in the economy and corporate structure that have built up over really 40 years that Atif mentioned at the top, I think have been pretty well recognized by the financial and investor community, which often has been the driver of pushing things too far in one direction and out of balance. And I think if you look at the last few years of what big investors, big investment banks, big market participants talk about as their priorities, shifting to a more long-term orientation and increasing focus on sustainability and ESG are all areas that are going to see more focus and more investment. The other thing I'd note, and it's a more cautionary, is that I very much agree with what Atif said, which is that the buildup of precautionary savings in both the consumer and corporate sectors and the level of rates we have right now does mean that it has implications for growth and productivity. And until those savings are channeled to a higher level of investment, potentially in things around sustainability, in mitigating climate change, etc., you do have the likelihood that you're not going to see another robust economic boom until those types of imbalances are addressed.
All right, Abid.
Look, I mean, I hate to be a downer towards the end, but I think if we think we've been on a
Come
roller
on,
coaster,
that's
if we think we've been on a roller coaster so far, I can assure you the next 5-6 months are not going to be any more stable than what we have seen over the last 5. Unfortunately, I think whether you look at a geopolitical situation, economic situation, just general societal tensions that we're seeing all around us, I think we're in it for a, I think there'll be a lot of uncertainty in the market, not just the stock market, but just in general society for the next 5-6 months at least. Obviously we have elections in November, and that has significant consequences for what may happen and how we may address these issues.
Well, thank you so much for a interesting sort of panel. I think this went by very quickly. This was the first of a multi-series discussion. So I think perhaps we can go deeper into other topics, next Friday at the same time. So thank you all for joining, and really appreciate it. And thank you for all the audience.
Yeah, thanks for organizing.
Thank you. Thanks, Shuja, and thanks to our audience.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care.